Tell you what, I am a sucker for a good religious horror movie. I think I love them so much because religion is just built for horror. Its very foundations are built on the cosmic and the weird, contending with things and beings outside of our world and plane. Just from a broad entertainment perspective, I think there is an endless mine there, but I also think horror is the perfect medium to explore that mine of religion and religious ideas in a very powerful and entertaining way. Unfortunately, it's so rare to get a film that does this. I mean, understandably, it's a bit touchy and risky to even make a film like this. Half of the audience won't watch it because it's blasphemous, and the other half probably won't watch it because they aren't religious. But even against the uphill battle, there exists some amazing films in the genre, led by, of course, The Exorcist. Not only one of the best horror novels of all time, which I just read over this past Halloween season, but truly one of the best and most moving religious films ever made. The dialogue around doubt, faith, and fear is outstanding and does so while also being visually provocative and challenging. After all, that's what great films do. They provoke. Provoke not just for the sake of agitation, but to invoke action on the viewer to think and engage with the material. That's why films like The Last Temptation of Christ are so powerful, as they force you to think. Think on the person of Jesus and what his sacrifice meant from a human perspective. For those who grow up in religion, you're not afforded the luxury of reading the Bible for the first time without baggage. You've heard these stories told for your whole life, which can be a blessing in one sense, but a curse in the other, as it deprives you from contending with your faith in a very pure and unadulterated way. This is again why I love religious films, as there is a great chance to shake off the cobwebs, confront you with what you already know in a new way, and hopefully provoke in a positive way. But as we'll see with The Carpenter's Son, this isn't always the case. Now, before getting into my thoughts on the film, I do want to clarify all of my ramblings that I just went on by saying that it's also awesome and valid to just love religious horror because it's cool and even transgressive. Art doesn't need to mean something every time. Sometimes just the enjoyment is the meaning. So while I hold to everything I said about the depth of the genre, I also hold to the latter view of just entertainment value, which works out because that's kind of what this film was. So let's get into the review of The Carpenter's Son a little bit. I think the worst thing about The Carpenter's Son is really the missed potential. The lost years of young Jesus as he grapples with his godly powers. That is such a sick concept. There is so much there to mine that could have been so cool, but this film just really does the bare minimum with an insanely awesome concept. But despite this film not doing enough, it does just enough to make it worth a watch. This film surprised me as it's a bit more slow burn than you would expect. It keeps most of the cosmic stuff for the ending, which is super cool. There are also some interesting ideas in this film, kind of similar to that of The Last Temptation of Christ, to really humanize Jesus, but nothing is really deep, and most of it's very surface level. There's some cool stuff done with Satan and some interesting dialogue there that feels very in this vein of, Milton's Paradise Lost. But again, all of this is really only mentioned in passing and is never really set or contended with in a deep way. I thought the young man who played Jesus, who I don't have the name in front of me, was exceptional. He is going to be an actor that you really need to watch, as he is definitely going places. This dude has star potential, very, very talented, and very able and capable to carry an entire film on his shoulders. Nick Cage is also good in this. This is not his most memorable performance, but he does a great job of taking it all the way without really taking it over the top or being goofy. So I thought that was great. I thought he did exactly what he needed to do in this movie. Also, it's a needless and pretentious nitpick, but the religious studies major in me has to mention that why was there a girl named Lilith? That makes absolutely no sense in the context of the story or Jewish mythology. They were straight up name-dropping Jewish demons like a superhero in an MCU film, and that bugged the heck out of me, especially because they got it wrong. Like, mentioning Lilith in the context that they did in this film, it's the same as like Iron Man doing an interview with Lois Lane. Like, that the level of incorrect we're talking about here is astounding. So while it's a dumb little thing, it immediately told me that the folks who made this did not care to do their research, or maybe they did but didn't do enough of it. Anyway, it's a little bit of a side note there, but that just really, really bugged me. More on that later, though. The film is based loosely on the infancy narrative of Thomas, but when I say loosely, it's very, very, very loosely based. It more so is just based on the idea of the book, not the book itself. So for those who don't know, the infancy gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical early Christian text that basically kind of talks about the childhood of Jesus, mainly focusing on, when he was like age 5, 6 to like 10 or something like that. A lot of people think it's connected to the Gospel of Thomas, but it is not. It's very independent and really is just kind of focused on the missing years of Jesus. Hence, that's why this movie kind of focuses on that. The reason they used that text for this story is because it's very famous for depicting a young Jesus with supernatural powers, and the way he utilizes his said powers can be a little bit weird, a little bit unsettling. That's why the book is popular, because it's a little bit controversial. It was probably written in like the 150 range, maybe a little bit earlier. So written after pretty much the entire New Testament was written, but still close enough that it really was pretty popular and circulated a lot, but it was never included in the biblical canon or anything like that. But the text itself is just a collection of short stories about Jesus as a child, just doing powerful, very impulsive, very strange things, such as blinding people around him who scold him, killing a boy, creating life out of a clay pigeon, like a bunch of weird kind of out there stuff, which again, brilliant idea to use it for a horror novel. Like there's a lot there to mine, which again kind of gets to the main criticism is that you have this amazing text, you have this amazing concept, and the bare minimum was done with it. But anyway, so look, do I wish this film was better? Yes, absolutely. Do I wish they did more with this amazing concept? Yes, absolutely. But do I recommend it? Yeah, I absolutely do recommend it. Obviously, with the caveat being, if you like stuff like this, I'm not recommending this to your church group, but if you like horror and enjoy religious horror, it's definitely something worth checking out because it's fun enough. I mean, the genre of religious horror is so dry, beggars really can't be picky here. So if you like the genre, support this film so that maybe we get more and hopefully better films like it. But for now, we just have to hold out until Mel Gibson's Passion 2, Resurrection Boogaloo, comes out in a year or two. All right, switching gears here, it's Sunday school time. Let me learn you something. So the last half of this video is going to be me nerding out and just kind of rambling over the lore of Genesis and how this film gets something very annoyingly wrong. I mentioned it earlier, and I want to expand on the issue of the Lilith character. I already mentioned how it was incorrect, but I want to dig into it deeper, explain why it's incorrect, and give some deeper context for the book of Genesis, because I just think it's really cool, and this is an opportunity for me to talk about it. Now, I may keep this in this video, or I may turn it into its own video. I haven't decided yet, but you will know as you're watching it if it's ending now. Tune in later for a Lilith video. If not, well, keep watching and learn the history of Lilith and the creation myths of Genesis. So first, let's break down the history of Lilith. Lilith is not biblical, nor are its origins in the Hebrew Bible, actually. The origins of Lilith, or the vague idea of a she-demon, come from a much early Mesopotamian mythology. It wasn't really until the 600s BCE that is when it was kind of worked into Jewish tradition. But even then, Lilith was never a single person, and more so just a personification of an evil spirit. Again, really just kind of taking from the Mesopotamian myth. But the more common and modern idea of Lilith only really started to come about in the Middle Ages. So 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, stuff like that. This is when the idea of Lilith not only being a person, but Adam's first wife really began to emerge. Lilith then becomes a figure of feminist folklore, and when most people think of the character today, this is how they imagine her. There were more developments with the Jewish tradition with time, but it's important to remember that this is 100% lore and myth and was not originated in the Bible or the Jewish tradition. This is a great example of one of those things of something external becoming internal, right? It starts on the outside, but it just becomes familiar enough that it works its way on the inside. So why did medieval writers give Adam a first wife? This is a fantastic question. Let's break it down a little bit. So again, another reminder, the Bible never says Lilith was Adam's first wife. This was medieval Jewish folklore, but it begs the question, why did this idea even come about? And there's really three main issues or puzzles that the Lilith character is attempting to solve. So the first puzzle is that there are two creation stories in Genesis. Most people do not realize that and are often shocked when they hear that. Oftentimes, to make things simple and with time, kind of like we do with the infancy stories of Jesus, you know, the manger, the wise men, all of that stuff, things just get compressed and combined together for simplicity. But much like in the Gospels with the infancy stories, there are separate accounts of creation, and they are actually very, very different from each other. So you have Genesis 1, which depicts man and woman created together. So the text says male and female, he created them. Then you have Genesis 2, and this is where you get the story of Adam being created first, with Eve coming later. So this is where Lilith comes in. Medieval rabbis wondered, rightfully, If Eve was created second, then who was the first woman that was created with Adam in Genesis 1? Well, their answer is, well, the first woman could have been Lilith, who came before Eve. She's the woman that was created at the same time as Adam, with Eve later becoming the second woman created by Adam's side in Genesis 2. But there's also a second issue and puzzle that medieval scholars were trying to overcome, and that's how to explain infant death and birth-related danger. So one of the ideas from the Mesopotamian myth of Lilith is that she was a she-demon who would cause harm to infants or threaten, postpartum women, or it's just related to birth, pregnancy, and stuff like that. And so using her as a tool to basically explain infant death, miscarriages, stuff like that, she became a solution for a problem that existed. But the third and final puzzle, and the more common one today, was gender hierarchy and equality in creation. So the common question from medieval readers was, why was Eve created from Adam's rib? Why not from the earth like Adam? The connotation from this is that Eve was created from Adam, and so thus there's some subordination there. But if you read Genesis 1, you get a different depiction where man and woman are created equally. So medieval scholars explain the conflict like this. The first woman, Lilith, was equal to Adam because she was made in the same way he was. But Lilith demanded equality because they were both made from the earth. Adam insisted dominance, Lilith refused, spoke God's name, and then left. God then made Eve, who was better suited for obedience. Now, it's important to mention that the modern lens that we look through here is we view Lilith as a feminist icon, right? To fight back against the patriarchy. But it's important to mention that that was not the case at the time. Scholars empowered Lilith with this meaning as a negative, right? This was not meant as some feminist icon. It was meant to justify the patriarchy, saying, hey, look, this is what happens, with a character like Lilith. Eve is much better, right? So modern readers will flip the symbolism and kind of reclaim Lilith as an icon of rebellion and equality, but that was not the intention for the medieval theologians when they were concocting this story. So that's a bit of the history for Lilith, but let's explain a little bit further why there are two creation stories, because it's a fascinating thing that most people don't know about, like we talked about. And so I want to kind of explain why there are two creation stories in Genesis. But before explaining why, let's kind of explain what we're dealing with here. So what we're dealing with in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is two creation accounts that come from two totally different ancient sources that were later kind of woven together in a single overarching narrative that encompasses Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. But based on textual criticism and understanding kind of the dating of the manuscripts, we can tell that they are two different stories. So Genesis 1, that is known as P, or the priestly source. This was written around the 6th century BCE, and the emphasis in this story is order, structure, liturgy, and God's transcendence. It really focuses on the cosmos and just kind of an overall hierarchy. When you read Genesis 2, this is commonly noted as J, or the Yahwist source. This was written much earlier, probably around the 10th or 9th century BCE, and this uses the divine name of Yahweh. And this is more earthly. It's more narratively focused. It's more anthropomorphic and story-like. When I say anthropomorphic, what I mean is this is the text where God is literally walking through the garden, right? So God is very human-like, right? It's like you can relate to this depiction of God a lot more. So the biggest question from this then is, why are there two different versions of creation, and why keep both of these versions? Well, editors deliberately placed these back to back and decided to keep these. This was an active choice to keep both of these stories in the Hebrew Bible. Why? Well, in the ancient world, it was very common to preserve multiple sacred traditions side by side rather than eliminating one or the other. Because keep in mind, these stories were not written, they were orally transmitted. People were telling stories to each other over decades, centuries, telling stories orally, and so many different traditions emerged through this process. So rather than keeping one and discarding the other, they decided to keep both versions because both were relevant. You had one story that was cosmic, orderly, liturgical, and then you had another that was personal, relational, and moral. Editors chose to preserve both because it showed God both as a cosmic creator as well as an intimate shaper of humanity. Together, they give a much fuller portrait of who God was. Okay, so this was a lot of info, but let me kind of summarize both things we just talked about again. So first, why did Lilith become the first wife of Adam? Well, there's a couple reasons. First, it was to reconcile the two different creation stories. Next, it was to explain infant mortality, postpartum danger, and just things related to childbirth that were negative. And finally, it was to justify medieval gender norms, right? Because there was a seeming contradiction between the two stories, they felt like they had to bridge a gap there. And then finally, why does Genesis have two creation stories? Well, they come from two different ancient traditions, each emphasize different theological themes. Because of that, the biblical editors intentionally preserved both. It was only later that medieval interpreters and modern interpreters as well decided that they needed to harmonize them. And this, I think, is the irony of the Lilith story. And Lilith is a fantastic example of biblical literalism often leading to the creation of Liliths. Right? Because folks try to fix seeming issues and contradictions in the Bible, but end up making things worse by doing so. Lilith was a God of the gaps type solution, much like the infancy narrative of Thomas. It was created to solve a problem that the Bible presented. Two creation myths seemed like a contradiction or a problem, and thus Lilith fills that gap. Problem with this is that a thing like two creation myths was never a problem. It was very intentional by the biblical editors. In reality, there was no need to fix what was not broken. The authors knew them to be two different stories and never found that contradictory. They were merely two stories meant to show different sides and natures of God, powerful yet personal. If you remove one of the stories, you remove a key characteristic of God. With the medieval and even the modern context where we read Genesis as a literal and scientific narrative, do problems like this arise? But arguably, that was never the goal of the text. When you read them as the authors intended and are reading them as two separate texts, it not only solves the imagined contradictions, but actually enhances the beauty of these stories. Today, we have such a low view of God that we talk about him like a person. But in that time, God was more of a concept or an idea that humans couldn't even fully understand. That's why these stories were written as they were, not to be scientific literature, but to be bigger than that. These stories show the complex nature of the God of the Bible and contrast him against the other gods of that time. Okay, so what's the takeaway? Well, the takeaway lesson from this, to me, is don't let something you don't understand change your worldview. Don't armchair expert your way into holding a simplistic view of something that requires nuance and deeper understanding. Always keep exploring, always keep understanding. Because if something seems shocking or Da Vinci Code level groundbreaking to you, you're probably missing something. People will always try to shock you or make you think things are simpler than they are, but the Bible is complex, as are most things in life, and should be engaged with as so. Finding the truth and holding religious belief should take a lot more to convince you or drive you away. Because if something like Genesis or the creation of the Gospels does come as a shock to you or shakes your worldview, that's very normal. But that says more about you and the world that you're living in than the text itself. It says more about your upbringing, your tradition, your worldview than anything. And that's totally normal. We bring ourselves to the text as we read and we respond through that lens. So as I already said, don't rush to judgment on things you don't fully understand. Always remember that there are brilliant scholars and intellectuals on both sides of the faith question that deserve contending with. So there is no definitive expert you can look to for consolation on the truth of the Bible. There is no trump card you can pull to make the choice easy. As Sartre tells us, we are doomed to be free and burdened with responsibility. You must decide for yourself and you can't rely on anyone else. Because you matter, do your homework. Don't get swayed by emotional appeals. Don't mimic select intellectuals. Contend, explore, engage deeply, and then decide what you believe to be true. And to clarify, I don't mean in a relativistic sense. I don't mean follow your own truth. I mean do your best to source out what you believe to be true. All we can do is do the best we can. So just do your best and then lean on what you believe to be true. Okay, Sunday school is over. I appreciate y'all allowing me to indulge a bit in a topic that I absolutely love, am fascinated by, and continue to contend with and wrestle with daily. If you learned something in this video, let me know in the comments below. Would love to start a discussion on this topic as well as the movie itself. If you saw the movie and had thoughts, also share those in the comments below. Thanks for watching, y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.